Um, my research question was over whether I could use AI to run a factory either at the operational level, so for example, production cell, or if I could use AI to run a factory at the managerial level. So, for example, making decisions about reorder points, reorder intervals for materials. In the initial look, the technology was more than there. I've kind of laid this out as a flow chart. So starting out, we have more than enough IoT enabled devices. Those devices are creating a massive amount of data. So typically what I was finding was about 5 gigabytes of data per week per IoT enabled device. Um, and I was able to find more than enough processors that could handle the processing speed required. Um, I was also able to find more than enough storage capacity. So the existing technology in terms of the devices themselves, the ability to process the amount of data that's coming through those devices, the ability to store the amount of data that was being processed, no issues. Um, Even in the case of speeds, with 5G enabled devices, I was more than capable of real or near real time um, data calculations using both the cloud as well as the edge. So, calculations that I needed to do closer to the IoT enabled devices, I did those on the edge. So, those were regional or even sub regional locations where I could perform those calculations. Other types of calculations that had a longer latent time, I was able to move those calculations to the cloud. So again, from an infrastructure standpoint, no issues. Um, and even from a programming architecture standpoint, the programming architecture which I was working with was called Lambda architecture. Well established. Some of the near real time calculations I needed to do were done on the edge using speed layers, where I was only doing calculations on immediately retrieved data. And then other types of calculations, again, where I didn't have latency issues, I was batching that data and moving it on to, again, batch layers closer to the cloud, where I could run those calculations on all the data. So the speed layers were only working with the most recent data, and it was all about speed. And then the batching layers, I was working with all the data, and the answers were more accurate there, but the latency times were longer there. So again, whether it's a physical infrastructure or a programming infrastructure, no issues. Where I started to see issues was in the sheer amount of money that was required to do this. Um, so what I was finding was the only companies, or I'm going to call them smart factories, factories that were using um, IoT enabled devices with um, algorithms making decisions either at the machine level or at the management level. These are multi-billion dollar organizations. My conclusion conclusions were in two areas. One is there's a very large price tag that is associated with carrying out these types of things. And of the companies that were doing it, most of them were dissatisfied. And I say here, only 3% of US companies have adopted machine learning. Again, cost was a big hurdle. And then of those, only 14% actually described their deployments as successful. So the problems besides the cost, the other big problem was conductivity. That there In the case of running a factory, it was seldom the case that everything was on the same platform or was purchased at the same time or could talk to everything else. Lack of continuity across the IoT enabled devices, outdated technologies across the devices made it very, very difficult as well as costly to try to create seamless communication across IoT enabled devices. The, the other barrier was a lack of the ability to purchase a ready made solution. Most of the companies were custom making their conductivity solutions, which again, not only cost a lot of money, but it's hard to find a lot of people that are capable of doing that. When I took a step off the shop floor and into the boardroom, looking at could I use machine learning algorithms to manage a factory as opposed to control the physical machines, I didn't have the problem of non-standard solutions that I was looking at SAP as an enterprise resource planning system. SAP sells machine learning algorithms, and the SAP databases are continually collecting data, all of the data transactions in a company. So the obvious question was, could I apply SAP's own machine learning algorithms to the data that they're collecting? And the unfortunately, the answer was no. That even though companies were marketing and selling um, machine learning algorithms, and all the infrastructure and technology and coding are widely available, the problem was the systems we were trying to apply the machine learning algorithms to were open systems and they were chaotic systems. So as open systems, there were things outside the systems that were impacting the results of the systems. That makes it hard to simulate solutions, even for something you program. Not impossible, but difficult. But what made it, bridging on the impossible was the fact they were chaotic systems, meaning that small changes in any number of variables produce disproportionate results. They weren't linear systems. They were, nonlinear, chaotic, dynamic systems. So even though the algorithms exist, their ability to be predictive under those circumstances is almost nothing. There is research being done in reservoir computing techniques for those types of systems, um, but those are still things that are going on in the lab. But my conclusion is AI is not ready to run a factory either at the management level or at the machine level, not because of the infrastructure, not because of the technology, but because a factory represents an open, dynamic, non-linear system where these types of technologies presently are struggling. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.